If kindness were weakness, then why did it terrify him the moment he saw it in her eyes? The sound of shattered glass cut through the marble hallway like a gunshot, echoing against the high ceilings of the Carter estate, a place where silence was usually more expensive than anything money could buy. And right there in the center of it all stood Emily Bennett, frozen, her hands trembling as fragments of a crystal glass scattered across the polished floor, the house manager's voice slicing through the tension, sharp and humiliating as he barked at her without hesitation, calling her careless, useless, just another maid who did not belong in a place like this. And at the far end of the hall, Daniel Carter watched without moving, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes cold, detached, as if what he was witnessing was not a person being humiliated, but simply a minor inconvenience in his perfectly controlled world. He did not step in. He did not speak, because in his mind, people like her were invisible unless they failed, and failure was the only thing he expected from them. Emily lowered her gaze, swallowing the humiliation, her voice soft but steady as she apologized, not because she believed she was lesser, but because she understood something that no one in that room did, that dignity did not need to be loud to be real. And for a brief second, something flickered across Daniel's face. Something unfamiliar, something he immediately buried beneath years of practice. Indifference, because men like him did not get shaken by maids. They did not question their judgments, and they certainly did not change before continuing. Comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The hallway cleared quickly after the incident, the staff disappearing like shadows, trained to leave no trace. But Daniel remained where he was, his gaze lingering on the spot where she had stood. Something about the way she carried herself refusing to settle in his mind as easily as everything else did. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and the estate transformed into a golden cage of soft lights and quiet power, he found her again in the library, kneeling beside a cart of books, carefully arranging them with a level of attention that seemed out of place for someone in her position. He watched her without announcing himself, noticing the way she paused to fix a torn page with gentle precision, as if even something broken deserved care, and it irritated him more than it should have, because kindness like that did not belong in his world. It was inefficient, unnecessary, and yet somehow impossible to ignore. When she finally sensed his presence and looked up, their eyes met for the first time without the barrier of hierarchy, and in that brief moment, Daniel felt something shift, not enough to understand, but enough to disturb the certainty he had built his entire life on. And without realizing it, the man who believed people only pretended to be good had just met someone who made him question if he had been wrong all along. Daniel Carter did not believe in second chances. Not for people, and certainly not for himself. And yet as the night deepened and the estate settled into its usual silence, something restless followed him from room to room like a thought he could not quite silence. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his private office overlooking the city, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath him, a kingdom he had built through precision, discipline, and an unshakable rule that emotions were liabilities. He reminded himself of that rule as he poured a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the dim light. But even that familiar ritual failed to steady him, because for the first time in a long while his mind was not occupied by contracts or numbers, but by a single image he could not explain, the way Emily Bennett had lowered her eyes without breaking, the way her voice had stayed calm even when she had every reason to crack. It made no sense to him, because in his world, people either fought back or they folded. There was no quiet strength, no silent dignity. Those were illusions people created to make weakness look noble. And yet what he had seen did not feel like weakness. It felt like something else entirely, something he had spent years convincing himself did not exist. He set the glass down harder than intended, the sound sharp against the stillness, as if trying to break the thought apart. But it did not leave. Instead, it followed him into the next morning, into the polished corridors where every movement was calculated, every interaction predictable, until it was not. Because when he entered the dining hall, he saw her again, moving with the same quiet focus, setting the table with careful precision, her presence somehow unchanged by what had happened the night before, as if humiliation had not touched her at all, and that irritated him more than anything. Because people were supposed to react, they were supposed to carry their wounds, to show them, to prove that the world had the power to affect them. But she did not, and it unsettled him in a way he could not ignore. He approached without announcing himself, his footsteps deliberate against the marble floor. And when she noticed him, she straightened slightly, but did not rush, did not panic, just met his gaze with a calm that felt almost out of place in a house built on hierarchy. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking, his tone controlled, distant, as if he were addressing a detail in a report rather than a person. "You're the one from last night," he said, not asking, simply stating. Emily nodded once. "Yes, sir," her voice steady, and that steadiness again. It pressed against something inside him he had long buried. He narrowed his eyes slightly, searching for cracks, for signs that she was like everyone else, performing, pretending, waiting for something in return, but there was nothing, only that same quiet composure. And so he decided to test it, because if there was one thing Daniel Carter trusted, it was pressure. Pressure revealed truth. Pressure stripped people down to what they really were. "Starting today, you will assist me directly," he said, his words sharp, final, the kind of command that left no room for interpretation. There was a brief pause, just a fraction of a second, but he caught it, the smallest flicker of surprise in her eyes. Not fear, not excitement, just calculation, as if she were measuring something he could not see. Then she nodded again. "If that is what you require." Her answer was simple, respectful, but not submissive, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Daniel turned away without another word, already planning the next step, because this was not about convenience. It was about confirmation. He would push, he would observe, and he would prove to himself that she was no different than the rest. That kindness always had a limit. That dignity always came with a price. But as he walked away, there was a quiet, unwelcome thought that lingered at the edge of his mind. What if she did not break? Emily Bennett had learned long ago that the most dangerous place was not where people shouted, but where they smiled while deciding your worth. And as she stepped into Daniel Carter private office for the first time, she felt that quiet danger settle around her like invisible pressure. The room was vast, lined with dark wooden glass. Every detail curated to reflect control and power. A world designed by a man who trusted structure more than people. She stood just inside the doorway, her posture composed, her expression neutral. But behind that calm exterior her mind was alert, observing everything, measuring every detail the way she had been trained to do. Daniel did not look at her immediately. He remained seated behind his desk, reviewing documents as if her presence required no acknowledgement, a subtle but intentional move, one that placed her exactly where he wanted her, beneath his attention, waiting for permission to exist. Minutes passed in silence, long enough to make most people uncomfortable, long enough to expose impatience, insecurity, or the need to be seen. But Emily did not shift. She did not clear her throat. She simply stood, her hands loosely folded, her breathing steady. And when Daniel finally looked up, his eyes met not nervousness, but stillness, and that again, that same quiet resistance, unsettled him more than he expected. He leaned back slightly, studying her, as though she were a problem he intended to solve. "You understand that this is not a promotion," he said, his tone even controlled. "This is efficiency. I require someone who follows instructions without question." Emily inclined her head slightly. "I understand." Her voice carried no hesitation, no eagerness, just acceptance. And that lack of reaction forced him to push further, because if she would not reveal herself willingly, he would create the conditions that would. "Your tasks will extend beyond standard duties," he continued, his gaze sharp now. "Watching closely, you will manage schedules, coordinate with my staff, and handle whatever I assign, regardless of complexity." And there it was, the pressure, the test, designed to overwhelm, to expose limits, to break the illusion of composure. A lesser person might have hesitated, might have asked questions, might have shown doubt, but Emily simply nodded. "If that is what is required." And again, no resistance, no attempt to impress, only quiet agreement. Daniel felt a flicker of irritation, because this was not how the pattern was supposed to unfold. People either resisted or they complied too eagerly. revealing their motives in the process. But she did neither. She simply remained, unchanged, and so he escalated, pushing her into the rhythm of his world without warning. The day moved quickly. Meetings, calls, shifting demands that required precision and adaptability. He deliberately gave incomplete instructions, changed details at the last moment, observed from a distance as she navigated each task, waiting for the moment she would falter. And yet she did not. She asked only what was necessary, adapted without complaint. And more importantly, she treated every person she encountered with the same level of quiet respect, from executives in tailored suits to the kitchen staff who rarely receive acknowledgement. And that consistency, that refusal to adjust her behavior based on status, it stood out. It lingered. It contradicted everything Daniel believed about human nature. Late in the afternoon, he found her in the hallway outside the conference room, speaking softly to one of the junior assistants who looked on the verge of tears. Emily handed her a neatly organized folder, explaining something in a calm, reassuring tone. The assistant nodded, her shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted, and when Emily turned and saw Daniel watching, she did not step away, did not apologize. She simply met his gaze, her expression unchanged. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because what Daniel had just witnessed did not fit into any category he trusted. It was not strategy. It was not manipulation. It was something simpler, and therefore more dangerous, because it suggested that perhaps not everything people did was driven by gain. He broke the silence first, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "You're not here to make friends," he said, as if correcting an error. Emily considered him for a brief moment before answering, her tone gentle but firm. Sometimes people do their best work when they're treated like they matter. The words were not defiant, but they carried weight, and for the first time, Daniel did not have an immediate response, because somewhere beneath his certainty, something shifted, not enough to change him, not yet, but enough to make him pause. And in Daniel Carter world, hesitation was the beginning of something he had spent years trying to avoid. Daniel Carter had built his entire life on control, and control meant understanding every variable in the room, every motive, every hidden intention. But Emily Bennett was becoming the one variable he could not define, and that alone made her dangerous in a way no competitor ever had. The following evening, the estate hosted a private dinner, a small gathering of executives and investors whose combined influence could shift entire markets. The kind of room where power was not spoken but understood, and as always, Daniel moved through it with quiet authority. Every detail aligned to his expectations, except one, because standing near the far end of the room, dressed in the same simple uniform that marked her as staff, Emily carried herself with a composure that did not belong to that role. She moved between guests with precision, attentive but never intrusive, her presence subtle yet somehow noticeable. And Daniel watched, not because he needed to, but because he could not seem to stop. He told himself it was observation, analysis, part of the test he had already set in motion, but there was something else beneath that reasoning, something less controlled. As the evening progressed, he decided to escalate, because if she would not reveal her limits through routine pressure, then he would force her into a situation where instinct would take over, where the mask, whatever it was, would crack. He approached her without warning, his voice low but firm as he handed her a tablet containing sensitive information. "I need you to deliver a revised presentation to the guests in 10 minutes, he said, his eyes fixed on her reaction. It was not a request. It was a calculated disruption, one designed to expose uncertainty. She glanced briefly at the screen, taking in the data, the unfamiliar names, the complexity of the task, and for a fraction of a second, the world seemed to pause. This was not a task meant for someone in her position. It was meant to overwhelm, to force failure, to confirm his belief that everyone had a breaking point. But when she looked back up, there was no panic, only focus. "I understand," she said quietly, and turned without another word. Daniel remained where he was, watching closely, expecting hesitation, confusion, anything that would validate his assumptions. But instead he saw her move with purpose, stepping into a conversation with confidence that did not match her title, addressing the guests with clarity, adapting quickly when questions arose. her voice steady, her reasoning sharp, and more importantly, her presence genuine, not rehearsed, not calculated, but real. And the room responded, not because they were being managed, but because they were being understood. And that difference struck him harder than he expected. Across the room, one of the senior investors nodded in approval. Another leaned forward, engaged. The energy shifted in a way that Daniel had not orchestrated, and that was what unsettled him most, because for the first time, something within his domain had changed without his control. When the presentation ended, there was a brief moment of silence before quiet acknowledgement spread through the room. Not applause, but something more significant, respect. Emily stepped back, returning to the edge of the room as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had not just crossed a line that should have been impossible for her to cross. Daniel approached slowly, his gaze sharper now, searching for answers he could not yet articulate. "Who are you?" he asked, the question low, direct, no longer framed as observation, but as demand. Emily met his eyes, and for the first time, there was something new in her expression. Not fear, not defiance, but a quiet certainty, someone who believes people are more than the roles they are given. She replied, her voice calm, and the simplicity of that answer frustrated him, because it did not explain anything. It only deepened the contradiction he was already struggling to contain. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing his composure back into place. "This changes nothing," he said, as if the words themselves could restore order. Emily inclined her head slightly. "Of course," she answered, but as she turned away, leaving him standing in the center of a room that no longer felt entirely under his control, Daniel realized something he had not expected. The test he had designed to break her had done the opposite. It had begun to break him. Daniel Carter did not sleep well that night, and that alone was enough to irritate him, because sleep had always been one of the few things he controlled without effort, a simple act of shutting the world out, of silencing everything that did not serve a purpose. But now his mind refused to settle, replaying moments he could not categorize. The way Emily Bennett had stood in front of a room full of executives without hesitation. The way she had spoken as if she belonged there, not as an intruder, but as someone who understood the language of power without needing to claim it. It did not fit. It did not align with anything he believed about people. And that contradiction lingered long after the lights of the estate dimmed. By morning, his frustration had sharpened into something more focused, determination. Because if there was one thing Daniel Carter did not tolerate, it was uncertainty, and Emily Bennett had become exactly that, an unanswered question, a disruption he intended to resolve. He arrived at his office earlier than usual, the city still waking beneath a pale sky, and immediately began reviewing internal reports, not because he needed to, but because he was searching patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might explain her, but the files revealed nothing beyond what was already known as standard background, minimal history, no indication of the competence she had displayed the night before. It was too clean, too simple, and that in itself was suspicious. By mid-morning, he made a decision. Not impulsive, never impulsive, but precise, calculated. He would not confront her directly. Not yet. Instead, he would observe, and more importantly, he would create pressure from a different angle, not professional, but personal, because people could maintain control in structured environments. But outside of them, truth had a way of surfacing. Later that afternoon, he instructed that Emily accompany him to an off-site meeting. No explanation, no context, just an order. And when she appeared at the entrance, ready and composed as always, he gave her a brief nod before leading her to the car waiting outside. The drive was quiet, the city passing by in blurred reflections against the window, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence stretching in a way that most would find uncomfortable. But Emily did not fill it. She simply observed, taking the details without intrusion. And Daniel noticed that. Of course he did. He noticed everything. They arrived not at a corporate building or a luxury venue, but at a small community center on the edge of the city, a place far removed from the world Daniel usually operated in, the kind of place he rarely visited unless there was a strategic reason. Emily stepped out of the car and looked at the building, her expression unreadable, but there was a subtle shift, something softer, almost familiar, and Daniel caught it immediately. There it is, he thought, the first crack, the first sign of something real inside. The center, the atmosphere, was entirely different from the polished environments of his usual dealings. Voices carried warmth, movement lacked precision. It was imperfect, human, and Daniel moved through it with quiet detachment. Speaking briefly with the director about funding and logistics, his tone efficient, focused on outcomes rather than emotions. But Emily, she moved differently. She greeted people with genuine attention, listened without rushing, offered small reassurances that seemed insignificant yet carried weight. And as Daniel watched from a distance, something unsettled him again, because there was no performance here, no audience to impress, no advantage to gain. And yet she remained the same, consistent in a way that did not align with his understanding of human behavior. At one point, a volunteer approached her with a question, clearly overwhelmed, and Emily stepped in without hesitation, guiding her through the task with patience, her voice calm, her presence steady. And the effect was immediate. The tension eased, the situation resolved, and it was done without recognition, without acknowledgement, as if it had never mattered to her whether anyone noticed. Daniel felt a quiet pressure build in his chest, something unfamiliar, something he did not immediately reject, because this was different from anything he had tested before. This was not about capability. It was about character, and character was not something he could easily measure or control. As they returned to the car, he spoke for the first time since they arrived, his voice lower now, less certain than he intended. "Why do you do that?" he asked. Emily turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Do what?" she replied, as if the answer were not obvious. He held her eyes for a moment before clarifying. "Help people when there is nothing to gain." The question lingered between them, heavier than any command he had given, and Emily considered it carefully before answering, "Because it reminds me that people are not problems to solve. They are lives to respect." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight Daniel could not dismiss. And as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the noise and warmth of the center behind, Daniel realized something he had not anticipated. The more he tried to expose her, the more she was exposing something in him that he had spent years refusing to see. Daniel Carter had always believed that pressure revealed truth, but what unsettled him now was that no matter how he applied it, Emily Bennett did not change. She adapted. She remained consistent. And consistency like that was something he had never trusted, because in his experience, people only remained kind when it was easy, when it benefited them, when it was seen. But the more he observed her, the more that belief began to fracture in ways he could not control. The following days became a quiet escalation, not loud, not obvious, but deliberate. Daniel increased the demands on her. Schedule, overlapping meetings, last-minute changes, tasks that required precision under time constraints, all designed to create cracks, to force mistakes, to push her beyond what any reasonable expectation would allow. And yet each time she met the pressure with the same steady focus, not flawless. No, she made small mistakes, human ones, but she corrected them without defensiveness, without excuses, and more importantly, without shifting her treatment of others. She still spoke to the staff with respect, still paused when someone needed help, still carried that same quiet dignity that refused to bend under strain. And that was what began to unsettle Daniel in a way he could no longer ignore, because it meant that what she was showing him was not situational. It was who she was. One evening, as the estate prepared for another formal gathering, Daniel stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds, the city lights stretching beyond the horizon, his thoughts quieter than usual, not because he had resolved anything, but because he no longer knew what he was trying to prove. Behind him, the soft sound of movement drew his attention. Emily stepped out onto the balcony, carrying a stack of documents he had requested, her presence calm. As always, she approached without hesitation, handing him the files. "Everything is prepared for tomorrow," she said, her voice even. Daniel took the documents, but did not look at them immediately. Instead, his gaze remained on her, searching, questioning, as if trying to find the hidden motive he had been certain existed. "You have not asked for anything," he said finally, the words measured, almost analytical. Emily tilted her head slightly. "I am doing my job," she replied simply, and that answer irritated him more than it should have, because it dismissed the premise of his question entirely. "People always want something," Daniel continued. his tone sharpening slightly. Recognition, advantage, security. No one operates without expectation. Emily held his gaze, her expression thoughtful, but not defensive. Maybe that is what you have been taught to believe, she said, her voice soft but steady. But not everything valuable comes with a transaction. The words settled between them, not confrontational, but undeniable. And Daniel felt that familiar tension rise again. Not anger, not frustration, something more complicated, something that did not fit within the structure he had built his life around. He stepped closer, his presence imposing, not as a threat, but as a test. Then what do you want, he asked, the question direct now, no longer theoretical. And for the first time, Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at him, really looked, as if weighing the truth of her response. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet sincerity that did not seek approval. I want to know that people can choose to be better, even when it is not required. Daniel felt something shift at those words, something small but undeniable, because for a moment it sounded less like an answer and more like a challenge. Not to his authority, but to his beliefs. He exhaled slowly, turning away, his grip tightening slightly on the documents in his hand, as if grounding himself in something tangible. You are idealistic, he said, the word carrying a trace of dismissal. But not as much as before. Emily allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Maybe, she admitted, but that does not make it wrong. The conversation ended there, not because it was resolved, but because Daniel did not yet have the language to continue it. As she stepped back inside, leaving him alone with the quiet hum of the city, Daniel Carter realized something that unsettled him more than any business risk ever had. The tests he had designed to prove her wrong were slowly proving something else entirely. And for the first time in years, he was no longer certain that he was right. Daniel Carter had spent years believing that people revealed their true nature when pushed far enough. But what unsettled him now was not that Emily Bennett resisted breaking. It was that she seemed to grow stronger in the spaces where most people would collapse. And that realization began to feel less like curiosity and more like a threat to everything he understood. About control, the following week brought a critical negotiation, one that would determine the future of a major expansion deal, the kind of situation where precision and dominance were expected, where weakness was exploited without hesitation. And as always, Daniel prepared meticulously, every detail aligned, every outcome calculated, but this time he made a deliberate choice, one that even he did not fully understand. He brought Emily with him, not as staff, not as background, but as a presence within the room. The boardroom itself was cold, polished, designed to intimidate. Long glass table, sharp lines, the city visible through towering windows. And as the opposing executives entered, their attention moved quickly across the room, assessing, measuring, until it landed on her, a maid standing beside the most powerful man in the room. And the reaction was immediate, subtle glances, quiet judgment. Assumptions forming without a word spoken. Daniel noticed it, of course he did. He had built his world on those same silent calculations. And for a moment, he wondered how she would respond when placed directly within that pressure. The meeting began with the usual formalities, numbers, projections, strategic positioning. Daniel controlled the flow with practiced ease, his voice steady, his argument sharp. But as the discussion deepened, tension rose. One of the senior partners leaned back in his chair, his tone shifting, dismissive, almost amused. You bring your staff into high-level negotiations now, he said, his gaze flicking toward Emily. The implication clear, not just questioning her presence, but diminishing it. And for a brief second, the room held its breath, waiting for the reaction. Daniel felt the familiar instinct to dismiss, to reassert control, to correct the imbalance. But before he could speak, Emily did something unexpected. She stepped forward slightly, her posture calm, her voice even. If you're concerned about efficiency, I can clarify the projection discrepancies in Section 3 of your proposal, she said. And just like that, the dynamic shifted. The partner frowned, caught off guard, while others in the room leaned in, curiosity replacing dismissal. She continued without hesitation, outlining a flaw in their numbers with precision, her explanation clear, grounded, impossible to ignore, and as she spoke, the assumptions that had filled the room moments before began to dissolve, replaced by something else, attention, respect, and Daniel watched it happen. In real time, the shift he could not control, the impact he had not orchestrated, and it struck him harder than he expected, because this was not strategy, this was truth cutting through perception. When she finished, there was silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that followed something undeniable. The senior partner straightened slightly, his expression no longer amused, but thoughtful. "We will revisit those figures," he said finally, and just like that, the balance of the negotiation tilted, not through dominance, but through clarity. Daniel continued the meeting, his composure intact, his arguments as sharp as ever. But something beneath the surface had changed, not in the room, but within him, because for the first time, he had not been the one to establish control, and more importantly, he had not needed to. As they left the building later that afternoon, the city noise rising around them, Daniel remained quiet longer than usual, processing, recalibrating. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "You knew they would dismiss you," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Emily glanced at him briefly, then back toward the street ahead. "People often do," she replied simply, and Daniel studied her, the ease in her response, the absence of resentment. It did not align with what he expected, and yet it was consistent with everything she had shown him so far. He exhaled slowly, a rare break in his usual certainty, and asked a question that had begun to take shape his mind. "Why does it not bother you?" Emily paused for a moment, considering, before answering in that same quiet, steady tone. "Because what they think does not define what is true." The words settled between them as they walked. Simple, but impossible to dismiss. And for the first time, Daniel Carter began to understand something he had resisted for years. Power was not always about control. Sometimes it was about the strength to remain unchanged when the world expected you to be less. And standing beside him, Emily Bennett was no longer a question he needed to solve. She was becoming something far more complicated, something that challenged the foundation of who he believed himself to be. The silence between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt charged, like something unspoken was building with every step they took. And Daniel Carter was not a man who tolerated uncertainty. Yet for the first time, he did not try to eliminate it. He observed it, studied it, even allowed it to exist, which in itself was a shift no one else could see. But Emily Bennett did. She noticed the way his questions were no longer designed to corner her, but to understand her, and that change, subtle as it was, told her that the walls around him were no longer as solid as they had once been. Later that evening, the estate was quieter than usual. No guests, no meetings. Just the low hum of a place built to impress, but rarely lived in. Daniel stood in the main living room, reviewing documents that he was not truly reading, his attention drifting, something that would have been unacceptable to him not long ago. And when Emily entered to deliver a final report for the day, he did not dismiss her immediately. Instead, he closed the folder slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "Stay for a moment," he said, his tone less commanding than before, more measured. Emily paused, sensing the shift, then stepped forward, waiting. Daniel studied her, not as an employee, not as a variable to control, but as something he had not yet defined. And that unfamiliar perspective made the next words harder than they should have been. "You said people can choose to be better, even when it is not required." He began, his voice steady but quieter. "Do you really believe that, or do you just need to believe it?" The question lingered, more personal than anything he had asked before, and Emily did not answer immediately. She moved slightly, setting the report down, her expression thoughtful. "I believe it because I have seen it," she said finally, her voice calm, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, because belief backed by experience was harder to dismiss than idealism. He stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing. "Then why do you look at me like I am capable of it?" he asked. And there was not a challenge, not a test, but something far more exposed, vulnerability, quiet control, but undeniable. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Because you are," she said simply, and the certainty in her voice unsettled him more than doubt ever could. Daniel exhaled slowly, turning slightly as if trying to regain the balance he had always relied on. "You do not know me," he said, his tone sharper now, defensive in a way he rarely allowed. Emily did not step back, did not soften her stance. "I know what you show people," she replied, "and I know what you choose not to show." The words landed with precision, not accusing, not gentle, just true. And for a moment, Daniel felt exposed in a way no negotiation or confrontation had ever made him feel. Because she was not attacking him, she was seeing him, and that was something he had spent years avoiding. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost quiet. Emily held his gaze, her expression steady. "Because someone should remind you that you are more than the version of yourself you decided to settle for." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that shifted something deep within him, something he could not dismiss, could not rationalize away. And for a long moment neither of them moved. The space between them filled with something neither had planned, something neither fully understood. Before Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter than it had ever been. "I do not change for people," he said, as if stating a rule he had lived by. Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth of it. "Then do not change for me," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Change because you know you can." And just like that, the control he had built his life around felt less certain, less absolute, as if the foundation itself had shifted. And as Emily turned to leave, the quiet of the room returning around him, Daniel Carter stood still, not because he had no answer, but because for the first time, he was not sure he wanted to hold on to the ones he had always believed were right. The moment truth reveals itself is rarely loud. It does not arrive with warning or permission. It slips quietly into the spaces people believe are secure. And for Daniel Carter, that moment came in the most unexpected way, not in a boardroom, not in a negotiation, but in the silence of his own office late that night. He had returned to work long after the estate had gone still. The city outside reduced to distant lights and quiet movement, seeking the familiarity of numbers and structure. To regain the control he felt slipping, but instead of clarity, he found something else as he opened a folder that had been mistakenly placed among his documents. Something thin, unmarked, easily overlooked, yet something about it drew his attention. He flipped it open without thinking, and what he saw stopped him completely. It was not financial data, not reports, but handwritten notes, detailed observations, dates, descriptions, patterns of behavior, and at the center of it all, his name, Daniel Carter, repeated again and again. His jaw tightened as he read further, each line documenting moments he had not realized were being recorded, interactions, decisions, even private conversations reduced to careful analysis. His mind shifted instantly, the uncertainty that had been growing replaced by something sharper, colder, familiar, suspicion, betrayal. This was what he understood, what he trusted. People always had motives, always had agendas, and now, finally, he had proof. Emily Bennett was not what she appeared to be. The door behind him opened softly, and when he turned, she was standing there, her expression calm but alert, as if she already knew what he had found. For a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with everything that had not yet been said. Daniel closed the folder slowly, his grip tightening, his voice controlled but edged with something dangerous. "What is this?" he asked, holding it up slightly. Emily's gaze dropped briefly to the folder, then returned to him, steady. She did not rush to explain, did not attempt to soften the moment, and that alone confirmed what he was already thinking. "You have been observing me," he continued, his tone sharper now, "documenting, analyzing like I am some kind of project." Emily inhaled slowly, her composure intact. "I was assigned to understand how you lead," she said, her words measured, honest. And that honesty, instead of calming the situation, ignited it further. Daniel let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Of course you were," he replied, stepping closer, the distance between them closing with deliberate intensity. "And what were you planning to do with this information? Report back, decide if I meet some standard?" His voice was not raised, but it carried weight, the kind that pressed down without needing volume. Emily held her ground, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "I was sent to evaluate whether you could be trusted with something larger than profit," she said, and there was the truth laid out without defense, without apology, Daniel felt something twist inside him, not because of the revelation itself, but because of what it meant. Every conversation, every moment, every shift he had begun to experience, all of it had been seen, measured, judged, and the vulnerability he had allowed, even in small ways, now felt exposed, manipulated. He turned away for a moment, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to contain the surge of anger rising beneath the surface. "You had no right," he said finally, his voice lower, tighter. Emily's expression softened slightly, not in guilt, but in understanding. "I did not come here to hurt you," she said quietly. Daniel turned back sharply. "Then what did you come here to do?" he demanded. And for the first time, there was a pause in her certainty, not hesitation, but weight. Because the answer mattered now in a way it had not before. "I came here to find out if you were capable of being the man people believe you could be," she said, her voice steady, and the words landed harder than anything else she had said because they were not about power or control. They were about potential, something Daniel had long dismissed as irrelevant. He shook his head slightly, the frustration clear now. "You lied to me," he said, and Emily did not deny it. "I did not tell you everything," she corrected, her honesty cutting through the tension in a way that made it harder to dismiss. "But everything you saw was real." Daniel's gaze hardened, his decision forming, because in his world, betrayal had only one outcome. "You are done here," he said, the words final, absolute. "You will leave tonight, effective immediately." The silence that followed was heavy, but Emily did not argue, did not plead. She simply nodded once, accepting the consequence, not because she agreed, but because she understood. She turned toward the door, pausing only briefly before speaking again, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "What you saw in me was not a performance, and what I saw in you was not a mistake." Then she walked out, leaving the door open behind her. And for a long moment, Daniel Carter stood alone in the quiet of his office, the folder still in his hand, the truth laid out in front of him. And for the first time, the clarity he had always relied on felt more like loss than control the night Emily Bennett left the estate. Something in Daniel Carter's world shifted in a way no financial loss or business risk had ever managed to do. But unlike those challenges, this one did not present itself as a problem to solve. It lingered quiet and persistent, refusing to fit into any structure he could control. The following morning the estate functioned as it always had, efficient, silent, precise, but to Daniel it felt different, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because something essential was missing. The absence of a presence he had not realized had become constant. He moved through his routine with the same discipline, meetings scheduled, decisions executed, but there was a fracture in his focus, moments where his attention drifted, where his thoughts returned to conversations he had not finished, words he had dismissed too quickly. By midday he found himself back in his office, the same folder resting on his desk, untouched since the night before. He stared at it for a long moment before opening it again, this time not with suspicion, but with something else, something closer to reflection. He read the notes more carefully, no longer searching for betrayal, but for meaning. Each entry was precise, but not cold. It did not reduce him to numbers or outcomes. It described choices, patterns, moments where he had the option to act differently and did not, but also moments where he had small decisions he had overlooked, instances of restraint, of consideration, details he had never assigned value to. And as he read, a realization began to form. Emily had not been documenting him to expose him. She had been trying to understand him, to measure not just what he did, but what he could become. And that difference unsettled him more than the initial discovery ever had. He closed the folder slowly, leaning back in his chair, the weight of that understanding settling in. Because if she had been looking for potential, then the question was no longer about her intentions. It was about his own actions. And for the first time, that question did not feel like an accusation. It felt like a choice. Later that afternoon, Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself. He canceled a meeting, not because it was unnecessary, but because something else had taken priority. He left the estate without announcement, without explanation, and drove back to the community center they had visited days before, the place that had lingered in his mind more than he expected. When he stepped inside, the environment was the same, imperfect, active, human, but this time he did not stand apart from it. He moved through it, observing not as an outsider, but as someone. Trying to understand, he saw volunteers working without recognition, people helping one another without transaction. And for the first time, he did not dismiss it as inefficiency. He saw it for what it was, a different kind of value, one he had never accounted for. He approached the director, asking questions not about funding or returns, but about impact, about outcomes that could not be measured in profit. And as he listened, something shifted further, something that made his usual metrics feel incomplete, insufficient. As he left the building, the realization settled in fully. Emily had not been testing his competence. She had been testing his character. And for the first time, he understood why that mattered. Back at the estate, the silence felt heavier, not because it was empty, but because it reflected something he could no longer ignore. He walked through the halls, past the places where their conversations had taken place, the moments that had once felt like disruptions now, revealing themselves as turning points. And as he stopped in the main living room, the memory of her words returned with clarity he could no longer dismiss. Change because you know you can. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that choice settling in, because for the first time, change was no longer something imposed. It was something he had to choose. And that realization, more than anything else, marked the beginning of something he had spent years avoiding. Not loss of control, but the willingness to let go of a change did not arrive as a single moment for Daniel Carter. It unfolded slowly, through decisions that once would have seemed insignificant, but now carried weight he could no longer ignore. The following days, the estate began to shift in subtle ways, not through announcements or declarations, but through actions that no one expected from him. He started with the smallest things, the things he had once dismissed as irrelevant. He spoke directly to the staff instead of through intermediaries, acknowledging their work with a simple clarity that did not seek praise, only recognition. And at first the reactions were uncertain, cautious, because change in a man like Daniel Carter was not something people trusted easily. But he did not stop there. During meetings, he listened longer, interrupting less, allowing space for voices that had previously been overlooked. And though his presence remained commanding, there was a difference in how he used it. Less as a force to dominate, more as a structure to guide, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the environment around him began to respond. Tension eased in places where it had once been constant. Conversations carried a different tone, not because he had relinquished control, but because he had redefined it. Yet despite these shifts, there was one absence he could not reconcile. Emily Bennett was not there to see any of it, and that realization lingered with a quiet persistence that no amount of work could silence. One evening, as he reviewed the latest reports, his assistant entered with a file, one that had not been part of his scheduled agenda. This came in from the foundation board. She said, placing it on his desk. Daniel opened it without expectation, but as he read, his focus sharpened instantly. It was a formal evaluation, a comprehensive report assessing his leadership, his decisions, his potential for a partnership that extended far beyond profit. And at the bottom of the document, a single name, Emily Bennett. The weight of that realization settled immediately. This had never been a personal intrusion. It had been a formal assessment, a decision point that could determine the direction of something far larger than his own interests. He read through the report carefully, noting the balance in her observations. She had not ignored his flaws. She had not softened her conclusions, but she had also not dismissed him. She had seen both what he was and what he could be, and that distinction mattered more now than ever, because it meant that her belief in him had not been naive. It had been deliberate, grounded in what she had witnessed. And for the first time, Daniel understood the full scope of what he had rejected when he told her to leave. It was not just a person. It was an opportunity to become something more than he had allowed himself to be. He closed the file slowly, his decision forming with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. He would not let that opportunity remain unresolved. The next morning, he called a meeting with his executive team, not to discuss profits or expansion, but to address something none of them expected. He outlined a shift in priorities, integrating community impact into their core strategy, not as a secondary initiative, but as a fundamental measure of success. The room responded with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Questions arose, concerns about efficiency, about returns, about deviation from established models, and Daniel listened, acknowledging each point, but his response was steady, unwavering. Profit is not the only metric that defines value, he said, his voice calm but firm, and for the first time his authority was not rooted in control alone, but in conviction. When the meeting ended, the direction was set, not because everyone agreed, but because he had chosen it. And that choice carried weight. Later that day, he stood once again in the main living room of the estate, the same space where so many of their conversations had taken place. And for a moment, he allowed himself to acknowledge what he had avoided. Change was not just something he could choose, it was something he needed to act on, not in isolation, but in the presence of the person who had made him see it. He reached for his phone, pausing briefly before making the call he had once dismissed as unnecessary. Because now it was the only step that mattered. He needed to find her, not to prove anything, not to regain control, but to show her that the man she believed he could be was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming real. Daniel Carter had built empires with certainty, but the moment he stepped outside of that certainty to find Emily Bennett, he realized that this was not a negotiation he could control. This was something else entirely, something that required more than strategy. It required honesty, and honesty had never been his strongest asset. The search did not take long. Not because she had left a trail, but because people like Emily did not disappear into places of power. They returned to places of purpose, and that is where he found her, back at the same community center, standing near a group of volunteers, her voice calm as she guided them through a task. The same quiet presence, the same steady composure. Unchanged by everything that had happened, Daniel stopped just inside the entrance, watching for a moment, not as the man who owned everything, but as someone who had come to understand how little that mattered in spaces like this. When she finally noticed him, her expression did not shift dramatically. No surprise, no anger, just recognition. And that alone made this moment heavier than any confrontation he had faced before. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, not because he needed control, but because he understood the weight of what he was about to say. Emily gave a small nod to the volunteer beside her before stepping away, meeting him halfway, the space between them filled with everything they had not resolved. Daniel held her gaze, not searching this time, not testing, just present. "I read the report," he said, his voice steady but stripped of the distance he once carried. Emily watched him quietly, her expression attentive, but guarded in a way that had not been there before. "And what did you decide?" she asked, the question simple, but layered with meaning. Daniel exhaled slowly, the answer forming not from instinct, but from understanding. "I decided that you were right," he said, and for the first time since they had met, there was no hesitation in his words, no calculation behind them, just truth. Emily's eyes softened slightly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. "People can change," she said quietly, and Daniel nodded. Not because he needed to agree, but because he had already begun to live that change. "I've already started," he continued, explaining the shifts he had made, the decisions that reflected something more than profit, the ways he had redefined what success meant within his world. And as he spoke, Emily listened, not interrupting, not questioning, simply taking in what he was showing her, not through promises, but through action. When he finished, there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but reflective, as if both of them were measuring the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. "You did not have to do that," she said finally, her voice thoughtful. Daniel shook his head slightly. "I did," he replied, "not for the deal, not for the outcome, but because for the first time, I understood what I was missing." The honesty in his voice carried more weight than any argument he could have made, and Emily saw that, not just in his words, but in the way he stood, the way he no longer carried the same rigid control, the way he allowed space for something more. She studied him for a moment longer before speaking again. "And what happens now?" she asked, and there was the question that could not be answered with strategy. Daniel took a step closer, closing the distance just enough to make his next words clear. "Now, I stop trying to prove anything, he said, and I start choosing who I want to be. The simplicity of that statement carried more meaning than anything he had said before, because it was not about her, not about approval. It was about him, about a choice he had finally made for himself. Emily felt something shift in that moment. Not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition. The kind that comes when someone shows you they have truly understood what you try to give them. She allowed a small, genuine smile, one that had nothing to do with the role she had played or the mission she had been given, and everything to do with the man standing in front of her. "You're not the same person I met," she said softly. Daniel held her gaze steady, grounded. "I know," he replied, and for the first time, that change did not feel like a loss of control. It felt like freedom, not from responsibility, but from the limitations he had placed on himself. And as they stood there, no longer divided by roles or expectations, but connected by something far more real, the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like possibility. The future does not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives in quiet moments where two people choose to stand still instead of walking away. And for Daniel Carter and Emily Bennett, that moment did not end at the community center. It carried forward into something neither of them had planned, but both had begun to understand in the weeks that followed. The changes Daniel had set in motion did not fade. They deepened. His company began to reflect a new balance, one where decisions were measured not only by profit, but by impact. Partnerships shifted, initiatives expanded, and for the first time, the people within his world felt seen in ways they had not before, not because he had become someone else, but because he had allowed himself to become more of who he could be. And Emily watched it unfold, not from a distance, but as part of it. She did not return as a maid, nor as an observer sent to evaluate. She stepped into the role she had always been meant to hold, a partner in shaping something meaningful. Her insight no longer hidden behind quiet observation, but integrated into decisions that carried real weight. And together, they built something neither of them could have created alone, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed incompatible, one defined by structure, the other by empathy. And as those worlds began to align, so did the space between them. What had once been tension turned into understanding. What had once been distance became connection. One evening, months after that first confrontation, Daniel stood once again in the main living room of the estate, but this time the silence felt different, not empty, not controlled, but calm, lived in. Emily stood nearby, reviewing a set of plans for a new community initiative, her focus steady as always, and Daniel watched her for a moment. Not because he was trying to understand her anymore, but because he already did. He crossed the room, slowly, stopping just in front of her, and when she looked up, there was no barrier between them, no roles, no expectations, just two people who had seen each other clearly and chosen to stay. "I used to think change meant losing control," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Emily closed the folder in her hands, giving him her full attention. "And now?" she asked gently. Daniel allowed a small, genuine smile, something that had once been rare, now becoming natural. "Now I know it means choosing what actually matters," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his words, no doubt behind them, just clarity. Emily studied him for a moment. The man he had been and the man he had become existing in the same space, but no longer in conflict. She stepped closer, her presence steady, grounded, and in that quiet moment, the answer to everything they had not yet said became clear without needing to be spoken. Daniel reached for her hand, not as a gesture of possession, but as a choice, deliberate and real. And Emily did not pull away, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about recognizing what they had already built together, not from status, not from expectation, but from truth. And as they stood there, the distance that had once defined them, completely gone. Daniel Carter understood something that would remain long after this moment. He had not changed because someone asked him to. He had changed because someone showed him that he could, and Emily Bennett knew that the man standing beside her was not the one she had first been sent to evaluate. He was the one she had believed he could become. And in the end, that belief had not only changed him, it had changed both of their lives, not through power, not through obligation, but through a choice they would continue to make together.